The place where the dead wait. Have you ever loved someone who was already dead? Most people would answer that question without hesitation. No. You can mourn the dead.
You can remember them.
You can carry their memory for the rest of your life. But that is not the same thing. To grieve the dead is one thing. To be loved by the dead is another. Many years ago, I met a man who told me a story so strange that I have never forgotten it. It happened in a port city on the edge of the Russian Far East during the chaotic years that followed the revolution. The old world had collapsed. Empires had fallen. Noble families had vanished overnight. And among the countless refugees drifting across Asia was a Russian exile. That man, he had once belonged to the aristocracy. At least, that was what people said. By the time I met him, there was little evidence of it. His wealth was gone. His title was gone. His homeland was gone. He lived quietly, almost invisibly, among strangers in a foreign land. Yet there was something about him that no hardship had erased. His eyes, they carried the look of a man who had witnessed something that should not exist. Something beautiful. Something terrible. For reasons I cannot explain, we became acquaintances, then friends. And one winter evening, while sharing a bottle of wine in a dimly lit room overlooking the harbor, he suddenly asked me a question. "Do you believe in fate?" I laughed softly and gave him the sort of vague answer one gives to philosophical questions. The man smiled. But there was sadness behind that smile, a sadness that seemed older than he was. Then he asked another question. "Do you believe in life after death?" This time I hesitated. He was not joking. His voice was calm, serious, as though the answer mattered deeply to him. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he set down his glass. Slowly, carefully, as though preparing to open a door he had kept locked for many years. "I once loved a woman." His voice softened. For the first time that evening, something almost warm appeared in his expression. "She was beautiful," he said. Beautiful in a way that made people forget themselves. She was kind, intelligent, proud, and she belonged to a world that no longer exists. He fell silent. His gaze drifted somewhere far beyond the room, far beyond the harbor, perhaps far beyond the living world itself. Then he spoke again. "The revolution took everything from us." There was no bitterness in his voice, only exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had survived the end of an age. "My family, my home, my future, and her." I nodded quietly. The story seemed familiar enough. History was filled with tragedies like that. Wars, revolutions, lost loves, broken lives. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. I thought I had lost her. The room seemed suddenly smaller. The wind outside had grown louder. I thought she was gone forever. His eyes met mine. And for the first time that evening, I felt something I could not explain. Not fear, not exactly. Something deeper, something older. She came back. The words hung in the air between us. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. She returned to me after her death. I stared at him, waiting for a smile, a sign that this was a joke. None came. His face remained perfectly calm, perfectly sincere. "At first, I believed it was grief," he continued. "A dream, a hallucination. That would have been the sensible explanation. You looked toward the dark window, toward the black sea beyond. But it was not a dream. She came night after night. I heard her voice. I felt her presence. And little by little, he paused, as though choosing his next words with great care. The boundary between the living and the dead began to disappear. The room was silent. Only the distant sound of waves drifted in from the harbor. The exile smiled, a small, wistful smile. The smile of a man remembering the happiest and most terrible days of his life. People say love dies with the body. He shook his head. No, love survives. Sometimes longer than life itself. Then he began his story. A story of a vanished empire, a doomed woman, and a love that refused to end at the grave. Chapter 1. A Russian exile's confession. The Russian's name was Alexander Orlov. At least, that was the name he used when I met him. Whether it was truly his name, I cannot say. The revolution had made liars of many honest men. Some concealed their identities to escape old enemies. Others buried their pasts because the memories were too painful to bear. Alexander belonged to the second kind. Whenever conversation drifted toward his former life, a shadow would pass across his face. Not fear, not shame, something closer to mourning. It was as though the man himself had survived, but the world he belonged to had died long ago. I first met him in Vladivostok. The city was crowded with refugees in those years. Former officers of the Imperial Army, merchants who had lost their businesses, aristocrats who now worked as laborers on the docks, men and women who carried fragments of a vanished empire in worn suitcases and fading memories. Alexander rarely spoke to anyone. He rented a small room overlooking the harbor and spent most evenings alone. Sometimes he would sit by the window for hours, staring out toward the dark sea. The locals considered him strange. Some believed he was mad. Others said he drank too much. Neither explanation seemed entirely correct. There was something unusual about him, certainly, but madness alone could not account for it. What struck me most was the peculiar mixture of exhaustion and anticipation in his expression. He looked like a man waiting for something, or someone, as if every passing day merely brought him closer to a long-promised reunion. One evening, curiosity finally overcame me. We had already shared several conversations by then. Nothing particularly personal. Discussions about books, politics, the weather, the countless rumors that drifted through the refugee communities. That night, however, the subject turned unexpectedly toward Russia. The harbor was hidden beneath a blanket of fog. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The small tavern was nearly empty. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Then Alexander lifted his glass and stared into the wine. "It is strange," he said. "What is?" "How quickly a world can disappear." I waited. He continued. "When I was young, I believed the empire would last forever." A faint smile touched his lips. The young always believe such things. His eyes remained fixed on the glass. "My family owned land near St. Petersburg." The words emerged carefully, as though he had not spoken them aloud in years. "We had servants, horses, summer estates." He gave a quiet laugh. "All the things people imagine when they hear the word aristocrat." "You must have been fortunate." "So I believed." The smile faded, until I discovered that fortune is simply another thing that can be taken away. Outside, a ship's horn echoed through the fog. The sound seemed strangely lonely. Alexander listened until it disappeared. Then he spoke again. The Empire was dying long before any of us realized it. His voice had become distant. The cities glittered. The balls continued. The officers wore their medals. The nobility hosted their banquets. We all behaved as though tomorrow would resemble yesterday. He shook his head, but beneath the surface, the cracks were already there. I had heard similar reflections from many exiles. Most spoke with bitterness, others with anger. Alexander spoke with neither, only sadness. The sadness of a man who understood too late what had been happening around him. Then came the war. His fingers tightened slightly around the glass. After that, everything accelerated. Food became scarce. People grew desperate. The newspapers carried worse news every week. And eventually, he fell silent. The revolution. Alexander nodded. The revolution. The words seemed to carry the weight of an entire century. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rain continued tapping against the windows. The lamps flickered softly. Then I asked the question that had been lingering in my mind. Were you already in love with her by then? His expression changed instantly. Until that moment, he had been speaking about history, politics, the collapse of nations. Now something far more personal entered the room. A warmth appeared in his eyes. A warmth I had not seen before. Yes. The answer came almost as a whisper, long before any of it happened. He looked toward the window, toward the darkness beyond the glass, and suddenly the years seemed to fall away from him. For the first time, I could almost imagine the young nobleman he had once been, the man before exile, before loss, before ghosts. I met her during the final years of the Empire. A small smile touched his lips. At a winter ball, his voice softened further. I remember the music, the candles, the snow falling outside. But most of all, he stopped. As though even now the memory possessed the power to wound him. Most of all, I remember her. The tavern around us seemed to disappear. The harbor, the rain, the refugees, the ruined world beyond the walls. All of it faded. Only the memory remained. The memory of a woman whose name he had not yet spoken. A woman whose death would one day destroy the boundary between love and madness. Alexander lowered his eyes, and at last, after years of silence, he whispered her name. The name of the woman he had never stopped loving. The woman who would return from beyond the grave. Chapter 2. The Princess of the Dying Empire. Her name was Elena. Even now, after all these years, I cannot speak it without remembering her face. Alexander fell silent for a moment after saying her name. The rain outside continued to fall. The lamps flickered softly in the tavern. And for the first time, I saw something almost youthful in the exile's expression. Not happiness, not exactly, but the memory of happiness. She was not a princess, he said quietly. At least, not officially. A faint smile touched his lips. But everyone called her one. Elena belonged to one of the old noble families of Russia. Her father had served at court. Her family possessed estates, influence, and generations of wealth. She had been raised in a world of grand halls, crystal chandeliers, and endless ceremony. A world that had existed for centuries. A world already approaching its end. I first saw her at a winter ball in St. Petersburg. Alexander's voice became distant, as though he were no longer sitting across from me in a harbor tavern, but standing once again beneath glittering chandeliers many years before. The room was crowded. There must have been hundreds of guests. Officers, diplomats, noble families. Everyone dressed in their finest clothes. Outside the palace, snow had fallen heavily that evening. Inside, music flowed endlessly through the halls. The empire was still alive, or at least it pretended to be. No one wanted to acknowledge the cracks spreading beneath its foundations. For one night, everyone danced as though the future belonged to them. And then Alexander saw her. She was standing near a window. His eyes remained fixed somewhere beyond the present. She wasn't speaking to anyone. She wasn't dancing. She simply stood there, watching the snow. That was what caught his attention. Not her beauty. Not at first. Many beautiful women attended such gatherings. What made Elena different was the strange sense of distance surrounding her, as though part of her already belonged somewhere else. She looked lonely. Alexander smiled sadly. And that was impossible. A woman like her should never have been lonely. Yet she was, even surrounded by wealth and admiration, even surrounded by music and laughter. There was a quiet melancholy in her eyes, a sadness that seemed entirely out of place in a young woman. Perhaps that was why he approached her. Or perhaps fate had already made its choice. She asked me a question. What kind of question? Alexander laughed softly. The last thing I expected. He looked at me. She asked whether I believed people could see the future. The question startled him then as much as it surprised me now. A young aristocratic woman should have spoken about music, travel, literature, anything but that. Yet Elena had asked it with complete seriousness. What did you tell her? I told her no. He smiled. Then she said I was fortunate. The answer puzzled him. When he asked why, Elena looked out at the falling snow. For a long moment she did not speak. Finally she said, because the future is often a terrible thing to know. The words lingered in Alexander's memory long after the evening ended. At the time, he thought little of them. Many intelligent people enjoyed speaking dramatically. Perhaps she was merely being poetic. But later, much later, he would remember every syllable, as though she had been trying to warn him. That first conversation lasted only a few minutes. Yet afterward, he found himself searching every room for her. Every gathering, every concert, every dinner. Whenever she entered a room, his attention followed her. And slowly, almost without realizing it, he fell in love. Not with her beauty alone, though she possessed that in abundance. Not with her family name, nor her wealth. He fell in love with the mystery surrounding her. Elena often spoke as though she were listening to distant music no one else could hear. She loved poetry, old legends, stories about spirits and forgotten saints. She collected strange books that most young women ignored. Sometimes she would interrupt a conversation and stare into empty space, not distracted, listening as though something invisible had spoken her name. Others found the habit unsettling. Alexander found it enchanting. Did she love you? For the first time, genuine warmth appeared in his face. Yes. The answer came immediately, without hesitation, without doubt. She did. The courtship lasted nearly 2 years. 2 years of letters, walks through snow-covered gardens, Summer evenings beside quiet lakes, conversations that continued long after midnight. For Alexander, they were the happiest years of his life. The future seemed clear. Marriage, children, a shared life stretching endlessly before them. The empire still stood. Their families approved. Everything appeared certain. Yet beneath that happiness, something darker remained, a shadow neither of them could entirely escape. Because Elena continued speaking about the future, not often, not dramatically, just enough to leave a trace of unease. Sometimes she would fall silent in the middle of a conversation, then look toward the horizon, toward something only she could see, and say things that made little sense. The old world is ending. Or, we do not have as much time as people think. Alexander always dismissed such remarks. He was young, in love. The future seemed infinite. How could he believe otherwise? But Elena never argued. She would only smile. A sad smile. The smile of someone carrying a secret she could never explain. Then, one winter evening, not long before the revolution, she said something he would remember for the rest of his life. Something that would haunt him long after her death. They were walking together through a snow-covered garden. The sky was dark. The trees stood silent beneath fresh snow. Without warning, Elena stopped. She turned toward him and asked, "If I died, would you forget me?" Alexander laughed. The question seemed absurd. Cruel, even. "You know I wouldn't." She held his gaze. Her expression remained serious. "What if I died tomorrow?" He took her hands, cold from the winter air, and answered as any young man in love would answer, "I would love you forever." For a moment, she simply looked at him. Then she smiled. A beautiful smile, a heartbreaking smile, and whispered, "Then perhaps death will not separate us after all." A cold sensation passed through me as Alexander repeated those words. The tavern seemed quieter now, the rain softer, the darkness outside deeper. Across the table, the exile lowered his eyes. His voice became little more than a whisper. At the time, I thought she was speaking metaphorically. He paused, then slowly shook his head. I was wrong, because before long, the empire would fall, and Elena would keep her promise. Chapter 3. The Fall of the Empire and the Coming of the Dead. When people speak of revolutions, they often describe them as sudden events. A single uprising, a single gunshot, a single day that changes history. But that is not how the end of a world feels to those living through it. For them, the collapse arrives gradually, one piece at a time. A rumor, a shortage, a protest in the streets, a government decree, another protest, another decree. And then, one day, people realize the world they knew has already disappeared. That was how it happened, Alexander said. No one believed the end would truly come until it was standing at the door. The years that followed were filled with uncertainty. The war continued to drain the empire. Food became scarce. Factories shut down. Soldiers deserted. The newspapers carried increasingly desperate headlines. And everywhere people spoke of change. Some welcomed it, others feared it. Most simply tried to survive. At first, Alexander paid little attention. His thoughts were occupied by Elena. They had become engaged. Their families had agreed to the marriage. A wedding date had not yet been chosen, but Both assumed there would be time. There was always time. That was the illusion of youth, the illusion of peace. Then the revolution came, and time suddenly became precious. The city changed almost overnight. Crowds filled the streets. Government offices closed. Military units vanished. New flags appeared where old ones had once flown. The certainty of centuries dissolved in a matter of months. No one knew who would hold power tomorrow. No one knew which laws would still exist next week. Friends disappeared. Neighbors fled. Entire families packed their belongings and vanished into the night. The old Russia was dying, and everyone could feel it. Alexander's family urged him to leave. Some relatives had already escaped abroad. Others were preparing to do the same. Yet he refused. I would not leave without her. His voice carried no pride, only the stubborn certainty of a younger man. At the time, he believed love could overcome history. Many young men believe such things. History rarely agrees. The months that followed became increasingly dangerous. Travel restrictions appeared. Roads became unsafe. Communication became unreliable. Even arranging meetings grew difficult. Yet Alexander and Elena continued to see each other whenever they could. Each meeting felt more precious than the last. Each farewell lingered a little longer, as though both sensed something approaching, something neither wished to name. Then came the final winter. Alexander remembered it more clearly than any other season of his life. Snow covered the city. The streets were strangely quiet. People spoke in whispers. Every conversation seemed filled with fear. Every knock at the door caused anxiety. No one trusted the future. And then one evening, Elena asked him to meet her, alone, at her family's estate outside the city. The request surprised him. The urgency in her letter frightened him. He traveled there immediately. The house stood silent beneath the snow. Most of the servants had already left. Many rooms were dark. The grandeur that once filled the estate seemed to have faded. It looked less like a home than a memory. Elena received him in a small sitting room near the garden. A fire burned in the hearth. Yet the room felt cold. Not physically cold, something else. The kind of cold one feels before a storm. The moment he entered, he knew something was wrong. She looked pale, exhausted, more fragile than he had ever seen her. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Elena reached into her pocket and removed a small silver cross. She placed it in his hand. I want you to keep this. Alexander stared at the object. It had belonged to her since childhood. He knew that. Why? She smiled faintly. Because I want something of mine to stay with you. A chill ran through him. Elena, she shook her head. No. Her voice was gentle. Listen to me. For the first time, fear appeared in her eyes. Real fear, not for herself. For him, you must leave Russia. Alexander immediately refused. She had expected that. Then promise me something else. What? Her gaze locked onto his. Intense. Unwavering. If anything happens to me, she hesitated. Do not follow me. The words made no sense. What do you mean? She lowered her eyes. For a moment, she seemed to be listening again, listening to that distant voice only she could hear. Then she whispered, some doors should remain closed. Silence filled the room. The fire crackled softly. Snow drifted past the windows. Alexander tried to laugh, tried to dismiss her fears, tried to convince her everything would be fine. But the words sounded empty, even to him, because both of them already knew the world outside was falling apart, and neither love nor hope could stop it. That was the last time he saw Elena alive. A week later, violence erupted across the region. Roads became impassable. Communication ceased. Entire districts fell into chaos. Alexander searched for news of her. For days, then weeks. Every rumor contradicted the last. Some claimed her family had escaped. Others claimed they had been arrested. Others still insisted they had been killed. No one knew the truth, or perhaps no one wished to speak it. Then, at last, the news arrived. Brief, simple, merciless. Elena was dead. Alexander stopped speaking. The tavern seemed impossibly quiet. The rain had ceased. Only the distant sound of waves remained. For a long time, he stared into the darkness beyond the window. When he finally continued, his voice had changed. It was softer now. Far away, like the voice of a man speaking from inside a dream. I thought my life ended that day. He paused. I was wrong. His fingers tightened around the silver cross hanging from his neck. The same cross Elena had given him during their final meeting. I did not know it then. His eyes lifted toward me, and for the first time that evening, I felt genuine fear. Because there was no grief in those eyes now, only certainty. The real story began after her death. Outside, somewhere beyond the harbor, a bell rang through the night. Alexander listened. Then he whispered, "The dead do not always remain in their graves." Chapter 4. Love Beyond Death. For several moments after speaking those words, Alexander remained silent. The harbor beyond the window had disappeared into darkness. The tavern was nearly empty now. Only a few lamps remained lit. Their fading glow cast long shadows across the room. The dead do not always remain in their graves. The sentence lingered between us. Absurd. Impossible. Yet something in his voice prevented me from dismissing it. I waited. And eventually he continued. The days following Elena's death passed like a fever. Alexander barely remembered them. He wandered from place to place. Sometimes he searched for information. Sometimes he drank. Sometimes he simply sat alone, staring into nothing. The world had become meaningless. The future had vanished. Everything he had imagined for his life had disappeared with a single piece of news. At night he slept only from exhaustion. And whenever sleep came, dreams followed. Dreams of Elena. At first, they were ordinary dreams, memories, fragments, the sound of her laughter, the touch of her hand, a glimpse of her standing beneath falling snow. Nothing unusual, nothing supernatural. The mind protects itself with memories. Grief often disguises itself as dreams, so Alexander thought little of them, until the night she spoke. It happened several weeks after her death. In the dream, he stood alone in a snow-covered field. The sky above was pale and empty. No wind blew. No birds sang. The world seemed frozen. Then he saw her. Elena, standing in the distance, exactly as he remembered her. The same dark hair, the same calm eyes, the same faint smile. For a moment, he could not move. could not breathe. He knew she was dead. Yet there she stood, beautiful and unchanged. She slowly approached him. Her footsteps left no marks in the snow. When she finally stopped before him, she looked directly into his eyes and spoke. Not many words, only 3. "I found you." Alexander woke immediately. His heart was racing. The room was dark. The dream felt unusually vivid, but that was all. A dream? Nothing more. At least, that was what he told himself. The following night, she returned. Again, he found himself in the snow-covered landscape. Again, she approached him. Again, she spoke. This time, she said, "You must not be afraid." Then she smiled and vanished. Night after night, the dreams continued. Always the same place. Always Elena. Always speaking as though no barrier existed between life and death. At first, Alexander resisted. He tried staying awake. He drank heavily before bed. He even sought medical advice. Nothing helped. The dreams continued, and with each visit, Elena seemed more real. Not less, more. Soon he began anticipating nightfall, waiting for sleep, longing for it, because dreams were the only place he could see her, the only place she still existed. Weeks became months. The border between memory and reality began to blur. Then something happened that changed everything. One evening, Alexander was sitting alone in a rented room. A storm raged outside. Rain struck the windows. Thunder rolled across the city. He was fully awake, certain of it. Then he smelled something. A faint fragrance. Delicate, familiar. He froze. It was Elena's perfume. The perfume she had worn during their first winter together. The perfume that no one else used. The scent lingered for several seconds, then disappeared. Alexander searched the room. Nothing. No explanation. No source. Only silence. The following evening it happened again. And the evening after that. Soon, other things followed. A whisper in an empty room. A shadow glimpsed in a doorway. The feeling that someone was standing just behind him. Watching. Waiting. Always waiting. Fear should have followed. Yet strangely, it did not. Because every sign carried the same feeling. Not hostility. Not anger. Love. The unmistakable presence of someone who cared for him. Someone who had never truly left. I know how impossible it sounds. Alexander looked directly at me. His eyes were calm. Steady? I spent months trying to explain it. Did you ever find an explanation? He smiled. A weary smile. Only 2. And what were they? His answer came immediately. Either I had gone mad, he paused, or she was really there. The wind outside had grown stronger. The tavern creaked softly. Neither of us spoke. Finally, Alexander continued. The strange thing is that I eventually stopped caring which explanation was true, because by then, he no longer feared the visits. He welcomed them. He lived for them. The dead woman had become more present in his life than the living. Every day felt empty. Every night felt alive. The world of sunlight became a burden. The world of dreams became home. And then, one winter night, Elena appeared more clearly than ever before. No snow, no mist, no distance. She stood directly before him, as real as any living person. Her face, was peaceful, almost radiant. She reached out her hand. Alexander could still remember every detail, every movement, every word. Come with me. Nothing more. Only that. 3 simple words. Come with me. The invitation was gentle, tender, loving. Yet something beneath it filled him with terror, because for the first time, he understood what she meant. Not tomorrow, not someday, now. She was asking him to cross the boundary separating the living from the dead, to leave suffering behind, to leave loneliness behind, to leave the world itself behind. Alexander looked at her, at the woman he had loved more than life, the woman he had mourned, the woman who had returned. And for one terrible moment, he wanted to say yes. Outside, a wave crashed against the harbor wall. The sound jolted him back to reality. The dream shattered. He awoke gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. Alive. Still alive. Across the table, Alexander slowly lowered his eyes. Many years had passed since that night, yet the memory remained sharp, painfully sharp. I never saw her again after that. His voice was barely above a whisper. The tavern had fallen completely silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Was that the end? For a long moment, Alexander did not answer. Then he looked toward the dark harbor, toward the sea, toward something only he could see. And finally, he smiled. A strange smile. Peaceful, almost content. No. He touched the silver cross hanging around his neck. The end came much later. His eyes drifted toward the darkness beyond the window, as though searching for a familiar figure waiting somewhere beyond sight. Because some loves do not end. The lamp beside us flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. And neither of us spoke again. Outside, the endless sea rolled beneath the night. Somewhere beyond the darkness, beyond memory, beyond death itself, perhaps someone was still waiting. Ending. Beyond the grave. The Russian finished his story sometime after midnight. For a while, neither of us spoke. The tavern had grown silent. The last few customers had already left. Only the distant sound of waves drifted in from the harbor. Alexander sat motionless beside the window, his wine untouched, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. At last, I asked the question that had lingered in my mind since the beginning. Do you believe she was truly there? For a long moment, he did not answer. The years seemed to weigh heavily upon him. Then he smiled. A tired smile, a peaceful one. I don't know. His voice was gentle. Perhaps it was grief. Perhaps loneliness. Perhaps madness. He looked down at the silver cross resting against his chest. The same cross Elena had placed in his hand during their final meeting. The one thing he had carried across revolutions, borders, and decades. Or perhaps love simply refuses to obey the rules we give it. Outside, the sea rolled endlessly through the darkness. Neither of us spoke. Alexander seemed to be listening to something far away. Something beyond the room, beyond the harbor, beyond the world itself. Then he rose from his chair, slowly, carefully, like a man carrying memories too precious to disturb. Before leaving, he paused beside the door. For a moment, I thought he might say something more, offer some final explanation, reveal a hidden truth. Instead, he simply looked back at me and asked one last question. If someone you loved called your name from beyond death, he smiled faintly. Would you answer? Then he left. The door closed behind him, and he disappeared into the night. I never saw him again. Some claimed he had moved farther east. Others believed he had boarded a ship and vanished. A few insisted he had died not long afterward. I never learned the truth. But sometimes, on cold winter evenings, I still remember his story. I remember the vanished empire, the beautiful woman who seemed to hear the future whispering to her, the young man who promised to love her forever, and the impossible question that followed them both beyond the grave. Was Elena truly returning to him? Was she a ghost? A dream? A symptom of unbearable grief? I cannot say. Perhaps no one can. Yet there is one thing I have come to understand. History remembers revolutions. It remembers wars. It remembers the rise and fall of nations. But the human heart remembers something else. A voice, a face, a promise spoken on a winter night. And sometimes those things endure long after everything else has vanished. Perhaps that is why stories like this survive. Because every person who has ever loved someone deeply understands the same fear. Not the fear of death, but the fear of separation. The fear that one day a beloved face will disappear forever, and the desperate hope that it will not. The sea continues to roll across forgotten shores. Empires continue to rise and fall. Generations pass. Names fade. Yet somewhere, in the quiet places between memory and dream, love remains. Waiting. Patient. Unwilling to surrender. And perhaps that is the true mystery. Not whether the dead can return, but whether love ever truly leaves at all. Thank you for listening to this tale of love, loss, and longing beyond the grave.